Something is definitely fishy. Pharmaceutical pollution is now surfacing in 80% of US waterways, from Viagra and Prozac to huge amounts of estrogen. It's my proposition we ought to start inserting fake bills in our water statements, billing us for the pharmaceuticals in our water, get people's attention. In the Potomac River, just upstream from Washington, D.C., about 30% of the fish are now intersex, which means they have both male and female characteristics, and more than 80% of smallmouth bass, male smallmouth bass, are carrying eggs. The likely cause is gender benders, endocrine disrupting chemicals that mimic female hormones. Of course, people are animals too, and what's happening to the fish is showing up in us, from the disproportionate birth of baby girls in the Arctic to falling sperm counts and spiking breast reduction operations in men. These chemicals are feminizing all us critters, and I mean that literally, not in a Robert Bly kind of way. The mind-bending reality in the US is that 95% of all chemicals in commerce have never been tested for human health or environmental impacts, and the EPA has banned only 5 chemicals since the law regulating chemicals was passed in 1976. Why? I think the best answer came from the renegade political candidate Jay Bulworth. You remember the movie Bulworth? You know, it ain't that funny, you contribute all my money. You make your contribution and you get your solution. As long as you can pay, I'm going to do it all your way. Yet the money talks and the people walks. The European Union crashed the party this year with the passage of the REACH program on chemical policy. In order to enter commerce, a large array of chemicals now has to be tested for toxicity. REACH uses the precautionary principle, aka the duh principle, which emphasizes prevention and compels society to look at a full range of safer alternatives. As a result, safer substitutes are already starting to replace some of the worst bad actors. And in this case, economic globalization has a resounding upside. As one of the world's largest markets, the EU has qualitatively raised the bar on global standards that companies must now meet. You can think of REACH as kind of the Left Behind series for retrograde chemical and manufacturing companies. Charlotte Brody has been at the forefront of the environmental health movement since 1994. As executive director of Commonweal, the renowned Bolinas Think and Do tank, which was founded by our dear friend and colleague Michael Lerner. She is succeeding Michael there now, and she is leading uniquely effective and innovative programs that are truly transforming our healthcare system. Her goal is an ecological medicine grounded in the recognition that human and environmental health are one notion, indivisible. Charlotte's path has been a winding yet very consistent one. She's directed her passion and gifts as an organizer to civil rights, women's and workers' rights, and public health. At the age of 16, she joined the famed civil rights group SNCC and went on to become a registered nurse. She moved to North Carolina, where she served as executive director of a Planned Parenthood affiliate in North Carolina and as a coordinator of the Carolina Brown Lung Association, focused on the health of cotton textile workers. In 1994, she joined Lois Gibbs of Love Canal fame to stop the hazardous dumping of waste and incineration. And in 1996, she co-founded Healthcare Without Harm and served as its co-director until January 2005. She was instrumental in coalescing mega communities of medical professionals, chemical industry workers, environmentalists, social justice advocates, and independent citizens. And Healthcare Without Harm has truly begun to transform an appallingly toxic medical system at large. But Charlotte is much more than all this. She's an authentically profound and original thinker about the deepest dimensions of what it means to be a compassionate human being. The heartfelt respect that she shows to people is key to all her successful collaborations. Her strategic brilliance is equaled by her kindness. Please join me in welcoming one of our most effective, visionary, and truly original organizers to feminize our thinking without toxic chemicals, Charlotte Brody.
Thank you. I'm so honored to be up here and so humbled to be talking to all of you in this auditorium. and to all of you who are patiently listening to us two-dimensional, giant-headed people on screens, and waiting to be able to talk to the perfectly nice-sized, three-dimensional people sitting right next to you at all of the beaming Bioneer sites. Kenny is right. I do want to talk to you about chemicals in commerce and chemicals in our bodies and what we can do about it. But I want to talk about chemicals not because I think they're more important than any other piece of our common wound, but because it's one more way for us to tell the story, one more meme, and of what's wrong, and a different path that may be more open right now of how we make things right. Really, even this part of the story can be told a lot of different ways. Through a Marxist lens, this will be a discussion on who controls the means of production and the need to internalize costs that have been externalized. For feminists, I want to talk about the male domination of the theories that make up science and the policy and regulations that are supposed to be science-based. For legislative reformers, this is about a set of broken federal laws, the hope that is coming from some cities and states and market campaigns, from Canada and the European Union, and the need for more state and federal chemical policy reform that recognizes that environmental policies also have to be public health policies. For students and teachers, I've annotated my slides, and my colleague and collaborator, Rachel Berry, has our reading list for anyone who wants it. All of my simple slides are yours for the having, and it's all posted on womenshealthandtheenvironment.org. For the spiritual visionaries, I am talking about the need to restore the feminine, the goddess in all of us, no matter our current gender or species assignment, as Carolyn Casey would say, and about the science that is suggesting that if we want to protect the planet, all of the planet, we focus on what we need to do to protect 12-year-old girls. And for health and justice activists, this is about how chemicals are trespassing into our bodies, most dramatically in fence-line environmental justice communities, but everywhere, and how our health, our ability to learn, our ability to have healthy babies is being violated without our permission, and without the chemical industry being held accountable for the harm that you're creating in fish, in frogs, and in us. But first, I have to talk about Rachel Carson, who died in 1963 at the age of 56, but whose 100th birthday we celebrate this year. Rachel Carson wrote The Sea Around Us on weekends and evenings while she worked full-time to support her family as a biologist for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. After the Yale Review published a chapter of her book, I just lost my page, but I know this story. After the Yale Review published a chapter of her book, it got picked. She won the George Westinghouse Science Writing Award. Winning that award made people pay attention. She became a Reader's Digest condensed book, a Book of the Month Club selection, and then Wallace Shawn at The New Yorker published a couple of chapters, and the story goes that William O. Douglas, the Supreme Court Justice, read it, sent it to Jackie Kennedy, the First Lady, who gave it to her husband, who gave it to the two senators from New York State, and DDT got banned. Oh, okay. I'm being marked here. You mean I'm small?
We want to lift you up.
No, give me a minute for this, because I'm losing my technology here, and it'll make me nervous.
Take as much time as you need.
Thank you. So Rachel, by the time the Sea Around Us came out in 1951, it was destined for the bestseller list, and it was on the New York Times bestseller list for 83 weeks. So Rachel got to quit her day job. She had time to be with her friends. She bought some land on the coast of Maine. She built a little cottage there. And she set down to a life of writing nature books. She wrote 2 more books in the 60s. She had a really devoted fan base, including a young Charlotte Brody, who was just amazed that somebody could write about science like it was poetry. And she was doing just fine, thank you. And then her friend, who was the literary critic for the Boston Post, sent her a letter. And in the letter, she talked about the aerial spraying of DDT that was happening in her community to control the mosquitoes, and how she'd come home from work to find the bird bath in her backyard surrounded by dead and dying birds. And she wrote about how, just a few days later, she realized that the mosquitoes were all still there, but that the bees and the grasshoppers were gone. After reading the letter, Rachel started collecting information about pesticides, information that became the book Silent Spring, published in 1961, 46 years ago, 2 years before Rachel died of breast cancer. Rachel's family and friends discouraged her from writing Silent Spring. She was a writer about the beauty of nature, and they thought this topic was too grim and that it would hurt her already fragile health. Her best friend kept calling it the poison book and kept trying to tease Rachel out of writing it. But Rachel persevered. After the New Yorker again published an excerpt from Silent Spring, an excerpt that Good Housekeeping refused to publish, things really started moving. Silent Spring and the federal laws that came out of Silent Spring saved the hawks, the eagles, the songbirds, and the pelicans that I'm lucky enough to see behind my Commonweal office in Bolinas. What saved the pelicans and the hawks, this little hawk, this is for the urbanites in the audience. Those pelicans are Bolinas pelicans, but the hawk lives on the X in the Essex House sign near Central Park in New York. So what saved them was Rachel's commitment to go where the evidence led her, even when the new science was uncomfortable and messy, to deeply understand what Mary Oliver means when she says, "What is called definitive right away is a brag." To be enough of a detached scientist to let go of your own frameworks of knowledge when they no longer accurately diagram how the world works. That's what Rachel was doing in Silent Spring. When she reviewed the evidence, she came to understand that the neat scientific framework that was being used to justify fogging entire communities with DDT because it was safe was based on a linear model that left out as much evidence as it let in. Specifically, Rachel wrote about how the framework didn't include the dose to birds who ate thousands of insects in a day and who were bioaccumulating much more of the DDT toxin than was calculated as safe. It didn't include the collateral damage that was part of the equation, that the amount necessary to kill a mosquito was more than enough to kill a bee or a grasshopper or other species. It didn't include that the amount considered safe because it had no visible harm on an adult, could have a profound effect on a developing child. This multi-generational effect is what made pelicans and hawks almost extinct. And the wholesale spraying of DDT didn't consider if there were safer ways to get the same result. Removing standing water, for example, or finding another way to get rid of the mosquito eggs rather than from an airplane onto an entire community. But the response to Rachel's critique did not take the form of reasoned discourse on the limitations of the dominant scientific paradigm. Instead, the chemical industry or the farm bureaus went for the jugular. Or maybe in this audience, and with a nod to Eve Ensler, I can say more directly what I mean. The chemical industry went for the vagina, mixed in with a little red baiting. Rachel wasn't even advocating for a ban of DDT, although that's what the federal law became. She was warning against the dangers of misuse and overuse of pesticides and proposing that instead of always trying to impose our will on nature, we should sometimes be quiet and listen to what she has to tell us. But the attack accused Rachel of wanting to end all commerce. After the second installment of Silent Spring appeared in the New Yorker, A man from California wrote to the magazine, "Miss Rachel Carson's reference to the selfishness of insecticide manufacturers probably reflects her communist sympathies, like a lot of our writers these days. We can live without birds and animals, but as the current market slump shows, we cannot live without business. As for insects, isn't it just like a woman to be afraid of a few little bugs?" There is a poltergeist up here. Just around the time that Rachel was reading her friend's letter about the backyard bird bath surrounded by dead birds, Alice Stewart was being surprised by the results of a survey she was conducting at Oxford University. I don't know if she was even more surprised by the reaction. But when Alice reported on her findings that children who died of leukemia or cancer had been, according to their mothers, X-rayed in utero twice as often as healthy children, the attack of the nuclear industry was swift and fierce. She was drummed out of Oxford for having the audacity to believe that a woman could remember if she was X-rayed during her pregnancy. The attack was so vicious that it took years for other scientists to work up the courage to do studies that validated Alice's findings. Alice was right. But it's not like she was the first person to notice that radiation was harmful. Evidence had been mounting for more than 50 years before her findings were published. But in each case, industry first argued that there was no problem, and that anyone who says there is, fill in the blank, trying to stop all commerce, overthrow the state, take us back to the Stone Age, and reverse all of the improvements that modern civilization has brought us. Then, when that set of defense mechanisms stops working, the response changes to solving the problem by simply lessening the dose, to the safe dose. In this orthodoxy, anyone who suggests that the science isn't being fully captured by a simple risk-based model becomes the real problem. And if the questioner is a woman, you throw in the hysterical bitch or the misfit witch attack. In DES, the deny everything and when that no longer works, decrease the allowable dose actually hurting vaginas and the women who had them. In DES, the government did nothing until there was proof, legal proof that would stand up in a courtroom in the form of white women in their 20s with cervical cancer. Human suffering turned into proof that was neat, linear, logical, mathematical, and way, way too late. I think there is a place for proof. I think it is a very fine thing to live in a country with the ideal of being innocent until proven guilty, an ideal we should put into practice more often, with clear guidance that it is meant to protect the freedom of the individual from the power of the state. But as we've all learned from Carolyn Raffensperger and others' fine work on the precautionary principle, legal proofs of human harm are the wrong criteria to use for chemicals. So how did this happen? Is this just the story of K Street lobbyists and politicians who are beholden to the industry that funds them? In part. But I want to say out loud to all of you that I also think we are being seduced and harmed by the linear, by the myth that neat mathematical formulas to determine risk are superiorly scientific even when they leave out more data than they include. I want to ask out loud if it is really so scientific and mature to have scientific conclusions and public policy based on the ideas that warnings in the evidence don't matter until there is proof, that emotions and suffering have no place, that intuitive actions to reduce harm based on common sense are trifles to be belittled and condemned. Isn't real discovery messier, layered, more like a labyrinth? On behalf of Rachel, on behalf of Alice, on behalf of Judith Helfand and all the DES daughters, I think we need to ask the defenders of proof, is it really good science, or is it just the most profound and embedded kind of sexism? Is it this or is it this? What kind of evidence is being ignored? I could talk about the doubling of asthma rates, or the stunning increase in autism, or the statistics on childhood cancers, but just to be thematic, let me keep the focus on sex. Fewer baby boys are being born, especially in places where contamination is the highest. This is a graph from a study of a First Nations community who lives surrounded by chemical plants in Sarnia, Ontario, where male births have dropped from over 50%, the red line in the middle, to 35%. Now, I'm from Detroit, Michigan. Hello to everybody in Detroit. And in Michigan, we talk about where places are by picking by our hand, right? So there's people nodding, yes. So Sarnia is right here. It's right across from Port Huron, for those of you who are hand geographers. But in this indigenous community that now is completely surrounded by chemical plants, baby boys are being born 1/3 of the time, then a little bit more than 1/2 of the time, which is the norm. But even worse than that, a brand new study released last month of indigenous people in Arctic villages in Greenland and Eastern Russia found that twice as many girls as boys are being born. In one indigenous village in Greenland, only girls are being born. Even when baby boys are being born, there is strong evidence that chemicals that at extraordinarily small levels of exposure act like estrogens are harming the male reproductive system. Hypospadias, this is when the opening of the urethra isn't at the tip of the penis. Now I've said both vagina and penis. And I'm still standing. So the opening is on the underneath of the penis rather than at the end. It's become an increasingly common male birth defect. Undescended testes at birth is going up, testosterone and sperm counts are going down, and testicular cancer in young men is on the rise. Every month there is another study that suggests all these different endpoints may be the same problem, which is now being called Testicular Dysgenesis Syndrome, or TDS, which is increasingly being linked to prenatal and early life exposures to chemicals that act like female hormones. And female hormones, when they come from chemicals rather than from our bodies, aren't so good for the female of the species either. While there isn't as much research on females as there is on males, premature puberty, breast cancer, infertility, spontaneous abortion, endometriosis are all on the rise and are all being linked in part to exposure to chemicals that interrupt a girl and a woman's own hormonal signaling. A fine new study in the brand new October 2007 issue of Environmental Health Perspectives by Barbara Cohn and Mary Wolfe and others found that women who were exposed to relatively high levels of DDT, Rachel Carson's chemical, before they were 14 years old had 5 times the rate of breast cancer than women with lower levels of exposure. DDT, bisphenol A, phthalates, dioxins, PCBs. As the mother of sons, I want my sons to be in touch with their feminine, but not like this. Not because my uterus and my breast milk were contaminated with feminizing industrial chemicals. Not because the chemicals that I was exposed to ended up exposing them. We are learning from the new technology called biomonitoring that the chemicals around us are in us, that small doses once thought safe can do us harm, that exposures to chemicals are one of the many factors, diet, stress, access to health care, genes, infections, poverty, racism, that in a nonlinear but ecological mix can combine into chronic disease. But this new ecological understanding also gives us hope, because any stressor in this mix of stressors that we can reduce will allow more resilience and more health. Chemical exposure is one of the stressors we can do something about. And the impact of what we are learning from biomonitoring, from low-dose effects, from chemicals that act like hormones, is beginning to be acknowledged in laws and corporate policies to reduce exposures. A new multi-state coalition called SAFER has formed to move policy in the same direction as Canada and the European Union, who have both taken steps to reverse the burden of proof so that in our lifetimes, or maybe in our children's lifetimes, if not ours, chemicals will need to have their safety demonstrated before they are put into the products we use every day, rather than people having to prove a chemical is causing them harm before that chemical can be removed from commerce. But the question of what that proof will mean is still up for grabs. So in closing, I want to ask for your help in preserving the male of our species and other species by embracing the feminine. By sticking up for the cult of the balance of nature and raising up, we could be C-bonds, and raising up the knowledge of Indigenous peoples' understanding that linear systems of equity and justice, of individualism and autonomy, and hierarchical structures of thought and organization have to be balanced, They have to be balanced in our own lives and in public policy by the feminine qualities of intuition and a prioritization of relationship and connectivity. They have to be balanced by what Carol Lee Flinders refers to as belonging than being defined by belongings, and what Carol Gilligan calls an ethics of care and empathy. They have to be balanced so we can create public policies that are less about filling all the blanks in a linear calculation that proves harm and more about the availability of solutions that are inherently less dangerous. So how do we do this? Well, we start with where we are. We start with how much we have siloed and hierarchically sorted and ranked ourselves. We quit focusing on the distinctions and start looking for the connections. We try to appreciate the feminine and the masculine in every one of us. We work from the ecological understanding that any stressor we can lift off makes us more resilient, so that any issue that any of us is working on that succeeds benefits us all. We let go of the fear that comes out as arrogance and find the courage to act like the respectful guests, as Yvonne Peter explained. We tell all the stories that explain on how what harms the fish in the Potomac or the rats in the lab are also going to harm us. We try to really live with the Bioneers idea that it's all connected, it's all alive, it's all intelligent, it's all relatives. That's what Rachel Carson was trying to teach us, and my relatives, I'm still trying to learn it. But it's hard to do. The work we have ahead of us will be difficult, but if it was easy, it would have already been done. And just because it will be difficult doesn't mean it won't be fun. Just because it will be difficult doesn't mean it won't be beautiful. But it will be hard. And so I want to model Nina's bravery and say, I need all of you to be there with me, and I want to be there when you need me. Happy birthday, Rachel. Thank you, and thank you.